Hi, hello and welcome from wherever you join me today. Yes, it's me again, Jim Black from the Three Hats Stage Media channel, trying to provide entertaining content media for all the world's stages. This is a Pause for Thought edition, where I review one of my favourite movies and see what messages we can take from it and how we could use those insights in today's busy lives. All the movies come from a book or screenplay, have a great cast and a fabulous soundtrack. As you can see from the lightbox just to my side, today's movie is no exception. It's Tolkien from 2019. It's based on the early life of Tolkien himself, and the screenplay is by David Gleeson and Stephen Beresford. There's an all-star cast. You've got Nicholas Hoult. He plays Tolkien, and he's been in About a Boy when he was a lot younger, The Favourite, X-Men, and more recently, The Great, in which he played Peter. There's Lilly Collins. She plays Edith Blatt, and she's been in Les Mis, The Last Tycoon, and she's also Emily in Emily in Paris. There's Colm Meaney. He plays Father Francis, and you'll know him from Layer Cake, as well as The Commitments, an earlier review of mine, if you want to catch it after this. There's Derek Jacobi. He plays Professor Wright, and you might know him from I, Claudius, Cadfael, Last Tango in Halifax, as well as The King's Speech. Anthony Doyle plays Geffrey, and he was in The Ordeal of Innocence, as well as The Lost City of Zed. There's Patrick Gibson. He plays Robert, and he was in The Passing Bells, as well as The OA. And then there's Tom Glyn-Carney, and he plays Christopher. And you might know him from The Last Post, King, or even Dunkirk. So I ask, is it right? Do all stories have a start, middle and end? And if so, does it really matter in which order those three things appear? Let's get into this review and find out. As I've just said in the questions, is life a start, a middle and an end? A perfectly written story that we're all just taking part in? Or is it a series of starts and middles and ends, all jumbled up and not necessarily in that order? Sometimes life is hectic, chaotic, and we don't understand it. And those are the times we need to stand back, take a look, a few deep breaths, and see if there's anything that we can do to change what's happening. And if there isn't, just simply wait for a time when we can. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien's life is shaped from an early age. The things he sees and hears and influences around him, just like all of us. He may not like some of the things that happen, or some of the ways he's shown to go down, but he embraces them and takes them on head on. So let's have a look at John's story as it changes and develops through his life, the friends he meets and the experiences he has, as we get right into this plot. This has only just become one of my favourite movies, and that's because it only came out in 2019, but I've already watched it quite a few times. It's a great story, well written and well acted. Although it's not entirely accurate, as in the timeline, most of the things that you see are portrayals of actual life events, even though they didn't happen at those particular times. But it's only been adjusted slightly. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it's still a great movie. It starts in World War I, but flashes backwards and forwards through different points of John's life. We're in the trenches at the moment, and he's not very well. He's a commanding officer, he's got a young soldier with him that looks after him, and he's just trying to do his best to get through the war, like they all were in those days. His main concern is one of his friends, which he must find and make sure he's okay. He's not heard from him in a number of weeks, but it's his quest to go out there and make sure that that friend is safe and well. We then flash back to John's past, where he's a young child with his brother, playing games, running around in the countryside. You know the type, wooden swords, pretending you've got a horse galloping along, and just having a bit of fun in an old-fashioned way. We then go back to the house, where his mum's waiting for him with Father Francis, who's looking after them based on their circumstances. She tells John that they've got to go to Birmingham because there's a house that's been found for them where they can board and lodge. When they get back to Birmingham, they move into a house. Now, as a little sideline here, I believe it's the Black Country Museum, which is a great place to visit if you ever get a chance. We move the story slightly along here. The boys are out playing as usual, learning, enjoying, loving life in their new circumstances. And when they get home, they find that their mum has passed away. She's worked hard all her life, and she dies at the age of 34, leaving 2 young boys with nowhere else to go in the world. But luckily for them, they've got Father Francis, who secures a lodgings for them with a well-to-do lady of Birmingham. She takes them in, and then this is where the story continues. We flash back to the trenches at this point, and we see the continued darkness and despair that all those soldiers of World War I were living in. It's a hard time. It's a sad time. Lives are lost for no reason. We flash back to the school. It's John's first days as a young pupil. He doesn't quite fit in, although he's trying his hardest. The English master, whose class they're in, reads out his name. He gets it wrong, and John corrects him. Something that boys shouldn't have done, because it was one of those schools and times when you didn't say anything unless you were spoken to. But John's not like that, as you'll find out as we go through the review. They're told to get out Chaucer, and it's one of those situations, if you can remember back in school, where you stand up with the book and you read until the master says to the next person, you carry on, and then the next person gets on, and so on and so on. But John's book has been taken from him by one of the other pupils who's trying to play a bit of a prank on him. But it backfires, because when it's John's turn, he stands up and recites the Chaucer poem word for word without even the text in front of him. Next we see a rugby match where they're all playing hard. John, being the outsider, gets bullied quite a lot, thumped a lot, pushed around a lot, and he starts a fight with one of the boys. It's going to turn out to be a great friendship, but at this point they're called into the headmaster's office to be told off. And the headmaster says, you know, comradeship is all about being together, understanding and looking after each other. So you will spend the rest of the term being as one. Whatever you do, he does, and whatever he does, you do. And it will teach you a lesson. We also find out at that point that the boy he had a fight with, the school headmaster, is his father. So as you can probably guess by now, there's going to be a great friendship formed. We get to the library, and there's one of those quaint English traditions where these boys like to drink tea. And they say to him, do you want to come with us? He declines, but then another boy comes up and says, I insist, you must come. And this is the forming of the 4 friends of Christopher, Robert, Geffrey and John. And they go to the local tea rooms to have tea and talk about things. Back at the house, there's another friendship starting to happen. It's between John and Edith. They like to talk to each other, they like to chat to each other about various different things. And this is the start of something long term. But again, I'll tell you about that a little bit later. We go back to the trenches. Again, it's a comparison that the movie makers are choosing to show you the differences between dark and light, sadness and happiness, and all those sort of things. John's still trying to find his friend, but will he do it in time? We'll have to wait and see. On another visit to the tea rooms, the boys do their usual thing. They chat about anything and everything. During the conversation, there's a great line where one of the boys says, I may not be able to choose how I die, that's left to fate, but how I decide to live is up to me. And I think that's something that we could all live by. And this is where they decide to change the world through literature, culture and music. And this is also where they form the club, the TCBS Club, which stands for the Tea Club Bavarian Society. This is where the movie moves on a little bit. So we're now at the stage where they're all a lot older. And the friendship between John and Edith is getting stronger every day. They're always meeting up, they're always going out, they're always talking about stories and hopes and dreams, just like you want when you're a younger person. There's a great scene where John takes Edith to the tea rooms, just on her own. You can tell they don't quite fit in because all the people that are in there are all well-to-do. The ladies have got big hats on and the men are all dressed up, you know, with top hat and tails and that sort of thing, because that's the sort of thing you did when you went out for tea in those days. They talk about the stories that John always tells, and they make a story up about Celador, which I believe is one of the influences for Lord of the Rings. But don't quote me on that. They get thrown out of the tea room, but I'll tell you why in the trivia. I don't want to spoil that just yet. And on another day, John takes Edith to meet his friends at the tea rooms. I told you they spend a lot of time in tea rooms. Not quite sure why, but it is quite nice tea. I don't know which one you like. There's a great conversation about composers. Edith plays the piano and one of the boys is a composer. What's your favourite composers? She's asked. She says it's Beethoven and Richard Wagner. And one of them mocks and says, how can it take 6 hours to tell a story about a ring? John gets jealous and decides that they must leave. And this is where Edith falls out with him. Or at least she's very cross with him. And that evening you can see it when she's playing the piano at home and they're all sat there with one of those tense moments. To make it up to Edith, he decides to take her to a recital of music by Wagner that's being played at the Symphony Hall. When he gets there, there's no tickets left for the seats that he can afford. So knowing that she's disappointed yet again, he sneaks her in via the stage door and they get as close to the stage as they can without being seen. They dress up in costumes that are out the back and dance to the music. And this is where the true love really happens between the two of them. And for a little bit more information, I believe that the ring cycle is called Das Rheingold in German. The next morning, John wakes up. He's very late. There's an exam and he fails it. And Father Francis is a little bit upset with him. He says it's because he's mixing with the wrong people at the wrong time and not concentrating anymore on what he should be doing. John complains bitterly. But Father Francis says, I'm your legal guardian until you're 21 and that's how it is. This shows love and love lost all at the same time, and it's a very sad part of the movie. The next thing we see is him at Oxford and the type of things that he gets up to. Edith's now gone. Although she's not forgotten, he has a letter waiting to post to her, but he just can't post it. His friends try and gee him up and make him happy again, but it's not going to happen because he's found that love and he does not want to lose her, because that's what it's all about to him. So we flash back to the trenches, where we see the dark and desperate times that's happening in that World War I in the Battle of the Somme. We see the craters, we see the smoke plumes, we see the mud, the barbed wire, and images that are cast in the shadows and in the light. We see the mustard gas. It must have been a horrendous time for the soldiers of World War I. It's an unhappy time, but will he get through it? And will he find his friend Geffrey? But that's for a little bit later on in the story. We're now back at Oxford, and we're going to see how he meets the next person in his life that gives him great influence, which is Professor Wright. There's a conversation at a fencing match between an elderly gentleman and himself, talking about language and theology and all sorts of things like poetry, which any Oxford scholar would also talk about. He wants to know more about this professor because he gets up and walks after him. He has to chase him down the path. And this is where we hear the story about the oak tree. It's a really good part of the movie. The writing of this is great, and Derek Jacobi just does not get it wrong. One word. I'm pretty sure it was done in one take. It's a representation of something that's big, strong and powerful, like we can all be. And it's all to do with the language that we use. It's not just a tree after all, it's an oak tree. It can provide many things for many people. But like I say, if you watch the movie, you'll understand what I'm talking about. When they finish their conversation, they turn and walk away from each other. And this is where John looks at his book and realises the book that he was reading, that the professor had seen when they were looking at the fencing match, was written by, yes, the professor. And he was very probably pleased that somebody had actually got his book out of the library. After this initial meeting, and John finding out all these things, he decides that he wants to be a part of Professor Wright's class. He teaches theology, language, old languages, ancient languages, any language you can think of, and the meanings of the words and how they fit in today's lives. And John just has to be a part of that. But can he get into it? Professor Wright doesn't want him because he's got lots of good students. John shows him his work, and from this moment on he gets accepted into Professor Wright's class, and I'm pretty sure that that helped him become the writer he became later in life. Now there's one more little bit of information here between Professor Wright and John, and it's at this point when Professor Wright points out that Tolkien, translated in its loosest terms, means foolhardy, and John certainly believes that that could be true. But it's basically that, if you know what I mean. The next thing we find is war has broken out, and the 4 members of the Fellowship must go off their separate ways, some into the army and some into the navy. And there's a meeting at Folkestone where John comes across Edith again. He finds out that Edith has become betrothed to somebody else, but he wishes her all the best, and just as he's about to get on the boat, she decides that this guy, unfortunately, is not going to be the one that marries her, because she wants to marry John. She tells him that and tells him to come home safe from the war. There's a final flashback to the trenches to reinforce the imagery that he's seen and the fact that that may have influenced his stories in later life. But from there we move to a hospital bed where John is in and Edith's with him. She's been there all the time that he's been back, and he's been one of those unfortunate people, or should I say fortunate people, to get some diseases out in the trenches which made him pass out and be unconscious for a very long time. But he's ended up back where he is, and Father Francis has to give him the bad news that his friend Geffrey lost his life in the war, like many great soldiers did of that time. So we now reach the spoiler alarms, and it's going to be very difficult not to tell you everything that happened right the way to the end of the movie, but I'm not, because there are some great scenes towards the end. We do know that he went on to be a famous writer, and many of us will have read some of his books, if not all of them. He's been well published, and some schools actually have Tolkien days, where all they do is read the books by himself. But at the end of the film, like I say, you must watch, because it does give you some ideas of how it may have all happened. It tells you about his friends lost and the fellowships being broken. But not really, because you can't break a fellowship. A friend for life is a friend for life, whether they're still with us or not. If you go through your life each and every day being kind and listening and trying to understand different points of view, you might make it a better place for all of us. Stories are starts, middles and ends, and not always in that order. And don't forget that. Embrace the change, stand back when you can't do anything, and try again another day. And now for the trivia and facts. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born in 1894, and he died in 1973. His wife, Edith Blatt, she was born in 1889, and she died in 1971. And she was in fact 5 years older than him. The tea room scene that I told you about earlier and said that I would mention later in the film is all to do with sugar lumps. John and Edith used to go to a tea room in Birmingham with a balcony overlooking the street, and as a little game they used to get sugar lumps and try and throw them into the top of ladies' hats. I don't suggest you try this at home. When John and Edith went to Birmingham Symphony Hall, they tried to get seats but couldn't. They were told that the only seats available were in the dress circle. John was going to pay for it, but unfortunately he wasn't dressed for the occasion. Did you know that that's why it was called the dress circle? Because you always had to be dressed in appropriate outfits to go and watch anything in those days. Tolkien's first book was The Hobbit, and it was first published in 1937. The final bit of trivia I have for you is that John and Edith had pet names for each other. These would later appear in the Lord of the Rings series. His name was Beren, and he was a mortal soldier that would fight to the end for anybody, and she was Luthien, and she was the daughter of Lúvatar, and she was immortal, and the only way she could give her love to him was to forsake her immortality, which she did. When Beren was killed in battle, she asked the gods if he could have his life back, and they gave it him, so they could live happily ever after. Well, in the story anyway. If you ever go to Wolverton Cemetery in Oxford, you'll see that John and Edith are laid together, and on the headstone it says Beren and Luthien. Good bit of information that, if you're ever passing that way. There's some great music in this movie, both classical and hymns, and anybody that's composed, written, published deserves to be listened to. The hymn you hear them singing is Immortal, Invincible, God Only Wise. But don't worry, I'm not going to sing it for you now. There's Robert Schumann, Frédéric Chopin and Henry Rowley Bishop. And of course there's Richard Wagner with the Ring Cycle. I hope you've enjoyed this movie review. If you want to know where my thoughts and inspirations come from, please click on the links in the bio below and they'll take you for a closer look. If you want to join our community, then hit that subscribe button. It's free and it won't cost you any money. If you want to know when I upload the next one, strike that bell and you'll receive a notification. Comments are always welcome. Drop them below and I'll do my best to get back to you as and when I can. I've been Jim Black for the Three Hats Stage Media channel for this edition of Pause for Thought. See you again soon.